All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to have to step out of the room for a minute. So welcome, everybody. I'll call to order this work session, the Anchorage Assembly. This work session is on the 2025 Property Appraisal Annual Valuation Report and the assessment process. And today is January 10th, Friday. We're on the record from 2:10 to 3:10. It's 2:12 now. We'll start with introductions. Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Karen Bronga.
Mark Littlefield.
Zach Johnson.
Scott Myers. Daniel Vol.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera.
And then we have Jack Adamus, our assessor, and I'm going to hand the gavel to Mr. Rivera and step out. I'll be back.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Mr. Gamus, for joining us for the annual evaluation report. I'll go ahead and we got it up, so I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we often like to show this work as a work session, the beginning of the year, to just really let all of you know what to expect and what your constituents will be largely seeing for the year. So without further ado, let's get started. So I often like to start with this slide. So the folks have been in the assembly position for some time. They probably are familiar with it. But I like to show this because really at the end of the day, it shows what we do. We administer exemptions and we value property. Kind of makes our job sound easy if we got two things. On a year round, we administer exemptions, as you can see. The other thing too, personal property. We'll talk a little bit more about personal property, but in the first 3 quarters of the year, we're working returns. And then the later third of the year, we're working amendments of property in our, for example, amends their property. Inspection. So we do try to inspect property. We try to inspect property every 6 years for that. And then January 1st, that's a critical date for us. By state statute, that's when the value of the property is as of January 1. It also does kick off a series of dates. And you can see the appeal period is right around the corner here. And that happens until about early June, we're wrapping up. Then we get into the valuation analysis. And the valuation analysis is when we start to look at and value for the coming year. So when we get into valuation analysis this year, we're looking at 2026. And yes, it's probably early to talk about 2026 when we're just in 25. Here we go. So this is 2 pie charts. And the pie chart on the left here, this is the total value of Anchorage, basically, $57.3 billion. Overall, it's up about 5.8% compared to last year on that. When you take a look at the pie chart on the right, it drops to 42.3 for that. And largely, that's when you're taking out all of the exemptions from that. So you're taking out partial exemptions, like your residential is a partial exemption. You're taking out your fully exempt property, like your government, and you are left with the 42.3 billion. And you can see it's important to look at this. This is basically our tax base. This is how the cost of government with property taxes is distributed. 65.8 for residential, 26.3 for commercial, and then you got about 8% for personal property. And also too, during this time, feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll try to be very mindful of time and try to give succinct answers, but happy to try to answer your question. So here is looking at kind of a historical trend spanning all the way from 1985 to current tax year 2025. I put it in today's dollars just to kind of give you a apples to apples comparison here. And you can see it was very high in the beginning in the early 80s. And I think it's safe to say we all know that it went down in the late 80s. And if you pay attention to the 21, 22, 23, 25 times supply, you can see right there, it did dip down. So I think that was in 2023. It went down, and largely that was just the inflationary. So after adjusting for inflation, we were actually flat that year, or relatively flat. It's just that inflation was 8%. And so that's why you see that dip. And you can see we're coming back to the kind of that stabilizing there from that. So here is the detail a little bit more. So that pie chart on the right that I talked about before the tax base, right? A few slides ago. So residential, that's 65.8. You can see where it's comprised of. And I think the main story of this slide is that we have a lot of single family homes. We're a single family home municipality, 21.6 billion there. We do have condos as well. We'll talk a little bit more about condos. About 15,000 in some properties for condos. When you look at commercial there, that 26.3 for that, it's a little bit more flat than the residential. You can see that it's pretty clear, 3.9 billion for industrial, and they go all the way down to hotels, about 680 million total. Now, one of the things that's interesting, like for example, this doesn't really show the average value. So like for example, the average value of an industrial hovers around the $1.82 million mark, where your hotels, the average is like 9 million, right? We just have a lot less hotels than industrial property. Here we go, exemption. So 57.3 billion is what our total value is. The 42.3 taxable, our tax base. So that leaves us with about what, $14.9 billion in exemptions. Basically about a quarter of our municipalities exempt. And you can see here at the top, we got two big bins. The top one here, mandatory state statute. This is what the state statute requires us. The biggest one there, $3.2 billion for the senior disabled vet. This is the $150,000 for that. Now, what's been interesting is the last number of years, I've been seeing that growing around the 5-ish% mark. And I think that 5% growth is really just we're getting more exemptions, right? We're an aging population, and I think people are becoming more eligible from that. So after the senior disabled vet, you get largely your government properties. If you recall, about 10% of the total value is government entity properties. And then after the municipality, education, federal, state, you get your churches, your charitable, your nonprofit hospitals. Now at the bottom there, that second big bin is your optional or local. So that's what we as a municipality chose to adopt. And I think at the end of the day, you can see there, by and far residential there, $3.7 billion for the residential exemption. That's the 40% up to $75,000. And for everyone here, and also for property owners, your constituents, March 15th is the deadline for this year for exemptions.
Ms. Bronga?
The exemption for nonprofit hospital, is that where assisted living facilities, do they get an exemption? I just noticed, we did a little looking into East Anchorage, and there's a really high number of assisted living homes that are in single family homes. And I'm wondering if they're getting an exemption for those properties, if that falls into that nonprofit hospital.
Yeah, good question through the chair to Bronga. I don't know if assisted living would be in there. I think the nonprofit hospital is going to be Providence, is going to be well over a majority, if not 90 to 100% of the bin there. I think when it comes down to assisted living, I think it comes down to a couple of things. Whether it's a nonprofit hospital or a charitable or religious, they all have to be nonprofit, and they have to have a mission that's specifically for that. So if it's a LLC that's for profit, it's right off the bat would not qualify under the state statute.
Thank you. Note for the record, at 2:16, Mr. Solt joined us.
Okay, well, moving on here. So here we have new construction and assessed values. So I talked very broadly already about just the high level for everything. So let's now dive a little bit more into the residential, commercial, and even look at the subcategories of them. Let's start off though, first looking at the new construction. So this is again, adjusted for inflation in today's dollars for apples to apples comparison. You can see early 2000s, we had lots of new construction, and the last number of years, it's been really hovering around where it's at now, which is about the 180 to 150. So this year, overall, you can see we're down about 16% compared to last year to 156 million. And if you look a little bit more closely here, you can see the residential's in red and commercial's in blue. Commercial's down this year about 40% from about 66 million to 40 this year. And if you look there, commercial, it's not uncommon for commercial to be a little bit more volatile from year to year than your residential. And I think some of this just really comes down to you get a big commercial project, it gets built, comes online, voila, a bunch of taxable new construction. And then the next year, not as much for that. But I mean, that being said, I still think there's projects in Anchorage for commercial. Residential, it is down, but very slightly, just at 3% this year from 120 million last year to 116. So here we go. Here's a property summary. So residential, I like to show this slide for a couple of reasons. I think the one I always like to show is, yeah, we assess, we have two jobs. We assess property and administer exemptions. But then you start to look at the numbers of what we're dealing with, and it starts to go, okay, yeah, maybe it's a pretty big job. 87,000 residential properties. This year, 6.7% increase on average. We'll get into that in a little bit here, a little bit more detail. Commercial, we're up on average 5%. Personal property, I have an asterisk here. We don't know the tax year 2025 value for personal property until later this year. Businesses are it's still open for businesses to file their business return. So we'll see later down the road when that happens. Anyways, overall, you can see that we're up about 5.8%. So looking at real property here. First things first, single family homes up about 6% on average. And I would say that 6% increase, I think that does reflect what we've been seeing in the market activity for 2024. So if you actually go look, the average MLS sale price is up right around there too. So I think that 6% is a good characterization of market activity of this year. Duplex, triplex up about 5.6%. And then the big one here in the room, you look at that, condos up over 15% on average. So that's up significantly for that. We have been working with condos the last year to improve our valuation on that, the methodology. During that time, the last year or two, we've also seen condos going up significantly. I think last year, the average MLS sale price was up almost 11%, something like that. So that 15% really is reflecting some catch up on our behalf for that. Now, at the bottom there, if you can take a look, single family, duplex, triplex.
Before you run on, I want to let you know, Jack, that we have a question for you.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I think this is interesting, and the work that you've been doing with, we talked about letters that you guys sent out to condo owners, and I think it sounds like there wasn't a ton of response to the notices that you sent out. I'm aware of at least one condo owner, and I think that there are more, who between the senior exemption and the residential exemption pays zero or close to zero in property taxes. And so I guess I just want my colleagues to be aware of that. I think there's a lot of revenue that we're not capturing because of that. Will this, I mean, how do you see that going in the future in terms of folks who own condos and pay very little or nothing in property taxes?
Yeah,
I see a shift there.
Yeah. So through the chair to Volan, I think that's a really interesting question. I did look at that a little bit. I don't have it. I could probably pull it up actually really quickly if you're curious. But as I was seeing an increase of 15%, I go, okay, who's this going to affect? Who has a residential? Who has a senior, et cetera, for that? I do have a slide in the next one that really shows that condos on average are the kind of your smaller 1 to 2 bedrooms are increasing more in the 18% range, where your larger ones are actually stabilizing a little bit. And when you actually look at the exemptions, the smaller condos have a significantly less share of, I would say, how do I characterize that? The less, do you mind if I maybe try to go to that slide? I don't think it's part of the the materials I did, but it is, I think, really interesting. So here's a little bonus for you, and hopefully this will maybe answer some of your question. But here's the distribution of property exemption by unit size, and you can see here efficiency 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom, right? The red crosses in this chart here show there's no exemption to them. So in efficiency condos, it's about 10% is what the exemption rate is. And then you start to get the 1 bedroom, and you're starting to get to the rate for exemptions, both senior residential disabled vet at about the 25. And you start to get to about the 3 to 4 plus bedrooms, and it starts to get to where single family homes are. So maybe could jump to this one here. Again, this is just kind of like bonus stuff. I don't know if you call this fun or I enjoy it. But single family, you can see on average 70% receive some type of exemption, whether it's the residential, senior, disabled vet. And then you get the duplex, triplex. That makes somewhat sense, right? You got your investor. Some of them live in a unit, some of them don't. And you got the condos that are right there with the duplex, triplex.
You go back to the previous slide. Dan, if you don't mind, ask a question or point out, that is very, very interesting. So what that says to me, and is just that 90% of the properties that are the efficiency condos are owned by people who rent them, right? That put them in the market for economic purposes. They don't live there, because if you did, you would have your residential exemption. Most people would qualify. And so as you get larger, you get more owners. That's what we see here, which leads to, again, a question of like, how do we target for people who are lower income, have a hard time getting into the market, to become owners of those kinds of units so they can get in and get up? Thanks.
May I add something to that?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things too that I found very interesting. So full disclosure, I do live in a condo, and I do have a few of my neighbors are actually pilots. Also talking to a realtor not too long ago too, I was asking, and they've been seeing that trend too, that it can be, these condos can be very attractive to pilots. I also think too, I don't really have any evidence of this, but I do often hear right sizing. And we also have a population of folks, as I mentioned, they're aging. They might be interested in actually downsizing to a condo and moving or doing the whole snowboard thing. And so maybe they don't qualify either from that. So I think there's multiple combinations, including as content you mentioned too, that there certainly could be.
Think about it, then, like, you have low ownership of the small units. You have, as you get larger, more ownership, at least as demonstrated by those who have filed. But if you have seniors who are right sizing, they're not going to not own, right? They're going to own the thing. So they're still going to qualify for the exemption. So much of those other items are probably smaller. The pilots are an interesting one because they are pretty transient population. And just so folks know, I've been pushing on a small state law change to allow people who qualify for first-time homebuyer loans to have a tax abatement, like, so we can really help to move people into the ownership market, make it more affordable for them. For 10 years, they could eliminate a portion of their taxes, and it kind of strengthens people's ability to get in or get up. But this is very interesting graphic right here. Scott.
As far as condos and efficiencies, smaller 1 bedroom, my experience, and especially in Eagle River, we get a lot of young military folks that purchase them as a first time home buyer situation and then turn them into rentals because they get PCS'd out of here. So the intent was when they purchased it, it was their primary residence, but as soon as they move or PCS, it becomes an investment property. So I don't think ultimately was purchased to be an investment property, if you will.
All right, anyone else? More? Next slide.
Okay, we'll get back on track here. So back to where we were here. So the bonus stuff is over here. But at the bottom there, you can see this is the average change of a single family duplex, triplex, and this by assembly district. And I think for this, Generally, things are going up relatively homogeneous, about a 1.5% spread. South Anchorage is going up about 6%, and the lower is the Eagle River Chugach area for that. But overall, not a significant spread for that. So here we're talking about the condo. As I alluded to already, I'll just use this to reiterate that in general, the smaller condos are going up more. Studios are a little bit of an exception or an anomaly here. Studios actually only account for about 1% of the condo population. So it's a very small population for that, which could be why we're seeing this small. But the 1 and 2 bedrooms, they are going up more. Your 3 and 4 bedrooms are going up less. The other thing that's interesting is the 2 and 3 bedrooms make up about 85% of the total condo population. So that's the bulk of the real estate for that. Okay, here we go, data. So I'm going to talk about a couple of data slides for this. I think for this one, a couple of things I want to highlight here. So the first one is the second line here, number of sale inquiries sent to the seller. So we send to the buyer, to the seller. So a total of over 8,100 letters were sent to the buyer and seller. I think I talked a little bit about this at CEDC yesterday. So sorry if there's a deja vu from that. But anyways, long story short for that, we got very few sales disclosed back to us from that. So that's definitely been a concern for us lately. You can see 2024, 2023, 2022, we use 3 years of sales when we do value. Part of that is we're a non-disclosure state, so we just really want to make sure we're seeing the trends for that. At the bottom there, average assessed value to the average adjusted sale price. So using all of those sales, we're about a ratio of about 95, meaning that for every if the property sold for $1, we're assessing it on average 95 cents to that dollar. Here's some other ratios here. So the first ratio here, this is the bold. So I'm bolding this because this is our bread and butter. But this is only the 2024 sales. The average assessed value of those sales disclosed to us divided by the average sale price. So for single family, 96%, condos, 95%, as you can see in the bold. At the bottom here, you can see this, I didn't bold this. This is just more like a really macro, high level. How are we doing? Are we out to lunch? We're just taking the average assessed value for a single family home there, dividing by the average MLS sale price. And you can see there for single family homes, we're at 94%. So that's reasonable. And then condos, we're at 95%. So
Wait, though, so the average MLS sale price as disclosed or as you've researched?
this is the app. So if you go online and just Google MLS and then go to the public statistics and click on single family homes, you'll
Okay,
get
got it.
509 or
Thanks.
it
Okay,
fluctuates.
got it.
But
Thank you.
so very, very simple, broad brushstroke. We don't put a lot of credence on this, but it's helpful to figure things out. Okay, moving on. So here's commercial for things. So a couple things. Well, I'll talk a little bit more, specifically retail and hotel talk a bit more. But land, we're pretty flat, I would say. Office, we're also a little flat here, 1.6%. For that fourplex apartments, we're seeing the 5 and 6.5% respectively for that. I think some of the reasons the rents have been going up. I think this last year we saw rents increasing about 6 to 7% on average for that. Vacancies also been relatively stable for that as well. Industrial, we're looking at a 7% increase on that. I would say industrial, that 7% reflects some catch up in the market as well. That being said, though, industrial has been for quite some time a pretty stable and probably the most stable, low vacancy, super low for that. And we've also seen rents up too for industrial. And I think there's a question.
We'll have first George and then Daniel.
Right, just clarifying for now, you mentioned just now rents going up as a result of this particular slide. Can you repeat what you said about commercial rents going up related to this slide?
Yeah, so when I'm speaking to him, I'm looking at mostly focusing on the apartments. And I would say on average, what we've been seeing is that rents have been increasing about 6 to 7% this last year in 2024.
The relationship of, from your vantage point, the relationship of this information to the increase of rent
Mhm.
is what? The relationship of the value to the marketplace or the relationship of the property taxes?
Yeah, I would say at the end of the day, we do so fourplexes and apartments. We categorize them largely as your commercial property because typically fourplexes are like the middle ground. They can kind of go between residential and commercial for that. But once you start getting to apartments, they start to attract your investor, your commercial investor. And so when you are an investor, you're saying, how much can I get for rents? What can my income be given this property? And if the rents are going up, typically your net operating income will probably go up too, assuming your expenses are flat. And a higher net operating income will typically indicate that the value will be also more valuable. If
That was a
makes
good
sense.
informational to, I think, open up additional questions, and I'll circle back around. Thank you.
And yeah,
But I think Drew, it's really difficult to answer that question. Which is it? It's hard to say. Is it inflation? Is it the cost of taxes go up? What is it? Everyone does it. But Scott has a question, but he's after Daniel. Hold on, Scott. So first Daniel, then Scott.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess first I'll just say, I think that there has been policy guidance / code changes on the part of this body to treat fourplex as residential. And so we did Title 21 amendments, we did Title 23 building code amendments to that effect. And I think also just the way that some of those are financed are interesting too. So yeah, I guess I would like to see that sort of integrated into our municipal thinking in a variety of ways, that fourplexes are, once you go above that, we're talking commercial, fourplex, 4 units and below, more residential. But I wanted to comment on the land, the average percent change, and just kind of put a pin in that. I think this is sort of indicative of the moment that you improve your land, the more the tax burden goes up. And then you have a slide, I'm jumping ahead, but slide 21 on the green cards. And we've talked about this before, how the green cards break down the land value versus the building value. I think you probably know where I'm going. Thinking about is that the best way, or are we disincentivizing people from improving their property because their tax burden will jump up so high? And can we adjust the weight of those things, the land versus the building? Can we have more of, if not a land value tax, then more of an emphasis on the value of the underlying land? We also, at the Community and Economic Development Committee at one point, and I think it would be good to circle back to that conversation, talked about potentially doing the concept of a universal building exemption. And so, yeah, again, just want to put a pin in that. And maybe when we get to that slide later, we can kind of talk about how that breakdown works. Thanks.
thank you for your comment on that.
Scott.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to clarify, and I agree, I'm glad Daniel said that. A fourplex and under is considered multifamily or a residential purchase where you can purchase as a primary residence, live in one of the units. Above a fourplex, 4+1 is commercial. But to differentiate, because he said commercial rents are going up in regards to residential living as far as apartment buildings are concerned, but commercial rents are not going up when it comes to commercial properties. When you're renting an office space or retail space, those rents have not gone up for years, at least in my experience. They're the same in Eagle River that they were 10 years ago. So I just wanted to, I guess, put out the difference there. For residences where someone's living in an apartment, yes, those rents have increased significantly, but not for retail or office space.
George.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And it's really, Jack possibly jumping across the presentation just for the time. But following along, the thread of the conversation that Daniel highlighted, which is kind of why I was asking those questions, it seems that I'm interested in the relationship between the improvement of a property, the value of that property, the rate of taxes, why it changes, and the cost of doing municipal business. I'm wondering about the relationship between, like, it seemed to me that a clean way to be thinking about this, and this probably doesn't make sense because it's probably much more complex, but the clean way to think about it would be that the relationship between what we want to collect in revenue from property taxes is somehow connected to what it costs for us to do business to some extent. So I'm interested in why it doesn't seem like that's connected. It seems like we're tracking the market improvements and I'm interested in that relationship between at what point are we crushing ourselves by limiting growth because we seem to be eating off of these sorts of investments in a way that's detrimental to ourselves. And I just don't understand the relationship between how much we collect at the market rate meets how do you square that off with the cost of doing business for the municipality? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Cool.
To member Mr. Martinez through the chair, Assistant Municipal Attorney Bowman, some of where this comes in is the requirements for taxation under state law that allow us to tax. The assessor is required to assess the full and true value of the property, and that's based on the market value. Now, the amount of tax that the municipality levies is based upon the budgetary process that the assembly engaged in. So if we wanted to adjust the amount of tax levied on an individual citizen, we can always reduce our budget and therefore have less of a tax burden in that manner, but we're constrained by state law how much we can adjust the valuation.
Thank you. Which in a non-disclosure state means what? Right? Like the relationship between that number in a non-disclosure state is how real to what it cost us to actually do business. We know what it cost us to do business, but how do you have a speculative framework? I understand that it may be legal. I just want to put it on the record, have some other questions, and maybe, this leads to additional insights. But how does that relationship work to the speculative nature of the market that in a non-disclosure state?
There's a burden, again, through the chair, to Assemblyperson Martinez. The assessor's office has a burden of going out and actually evaluating the property and assessing the value of the property. Obviously, having the market data strongly can assist in that role, some of the best evidence they can have. But Jack also has a group of people that goes out, looks at the property using the processes and expertise of property assessment expertise. They go out and they look and they go, okay, it's a 5-bedroom house.
Right on.
With
Our
this-
folks do their job in compliance with state statute. I want to be real clear about that, and thank you for doing that. So then the relationship between what you have to do at the market level and kind of under state statute, and the property taxes that a person pays. So if the assessor's team goes out there following state statute and it is determined that the price is as it's determined here, like we were conservative with the valuation of certain classifications of real estate. And so then we change that because the market says we can, allowed, whether we should be, it's different, but we're allowed to. We change that. What happens to taxes? Are they raised on those properties?
Yeah, through the chair to Martinez, I think there's a couple of things. So maybe I could start off with the macro perspective. Okay. So in a year when we see a big increase in values, last year we saw about a 9% increase for single family homes on average. When you see a big increase like that, that tends to have a downward pressure on the mill rates. So as Mr. Bowman has mentioned, right, we have the assessed value, we then get the tax base, and of that tax base is what the mill rates are set on, right? So macro perspective, the tax base goes up, all things being held constant, the mill rate's going to be going down. Okay. Now, yeah, there's many other factors there, but that's your simplest lever. Now, I think there's a second component to your question, which is what happens if a property goes up more than the average, right? So if you have, for example, the average increases, I'm just making this up, 1%, and my property went up 5%, right? That one property probably would end up paying more in taxes that year, right? One property is not going to move mill rates, right? As I talked about, the macro tax base is what will have an influence on the mill rates. Again, holding all things constant. So hopefully maybe that can at least paint a picture of kind of the relationship.
I think you've helped to paint the picture for the public. Thank you.
I have myself, I think you have two things kind of tangential. Jack, I just had a terrible thought. My realtor friend over here, probably gonna throw a rock at me in a minute, but have we ever contemplated providing a financial incentive to sellers to disclose the sale price of their property?
Yeah, through the chair, to the chair, I've thought about that as a brief passing. I think there's other ways too. I think I'm certainly interested in seeing what kind of available data we could buy from like a macro perspective of market data. So for this last year, and you can see here, retail would be a good example. We did buy some market data for commercial, and that market data showed that we were low in retail, hence why we're seeing about a 11% increase this year.
Right, I get that, but that's generalized. You're not getting specific lot sale information because it's non-disclosure, even those third parties aren't gonna have the fine detail. Anyhow, just a thought. Okay,
Yeah.
second question, not addressed here. We were going back and forth laughing at our property assessments that have gone up substantially in relationship to our neighbors and every year substantially more than the average. It was just hilarious to me. But it actually raised the conversation. I don't care about that for me personally, or, that's not the point. The CAMA update. So where are we now in the context? We've done it. It's working, problem solving problems, anything come up? Where are we?
Yeah,
And
so
for the new members, what does that mean?
Sure. So CAMA, Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal, basically it's our program that we use to do the valuation of these properties, right? And so we did have it was about a $7.1 million project. We did go live, I believe it was tax year 2022. We went live with that. And we were slightly under budget, so that was really good. I think with all big software projects, right, there's always going to be little surprises afterwards. So we definitely were working through that. I think we're starting to stabilize on that, on the program now. So I think that's good news for that. And I think that's probably the big update with that right now.
Stabilizing, and you don't have any terrible news to tell us?
No.
Okay, thanks. Scott?
All I wanted to say was give Jack and his office a compliment because their data is pretty accurate. If I pull MLS data, which I just did, he's within like $7,000 of real-time numbers. So they do a very good job, I guess, of trying to figure out values, given that we're a non-disclosure state.
I think that ties back to what George was raising, kind of consideration of then. It's interesting. Thanks.
Can I
That was
just
good
throw?
kudos from a high professional in the field.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. And I do hear, and I kindly hear your thoughts on the fourplex with the categorization of it potentially being in residential. Like I said, we kind of look at kind of both. It can attract an investor kind of income with a fourplex. Hopefully you'll nod your head to that, but it also will attract your owner occupier too from that. It's just from that. But yeah, I think maybe if I could just a quick comment too with the non-disclosure state and everything. I mean, at the end of the day, if you see a state that does have disclosures, that tax base, that accuracy, you will inevitably be more accurate from that, right? And from an equitable standpoint, there's a lot of value there. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, as I mentioned, retail, we're going up about 11%. Hotels are going up 14. I think those are the two big ones. For retail, as I mentioned, we did get additional data this last year, and the last couple of years, we've been increasing retail 1%, 2%, 3% respectively, and we were too conservative. At the end of the day, though, the valuation changes, especially for your larger, so your box stores, your regional malls. Box stores, what we've been seeing is that the rents are just relatively flat. I'm glad that Myers also would agree with that. Regional malls, we've been seeing the vacancy still relatively high. I recently heard that maybe the vacancy is going down slightly in some of these, but and then strip centers, single and multi occupancy, fast food, basically the rest of them. That's what's going up by the double digits there. And a couple of things for retail employment. So I think the pandemic had really impacted the retail. I would say that it's mostly or partially recovered from that. And then I think the other things too. What's interesting is I've been seeing, looking at like online sales, and I think online sales are continuing to slowly erode, but the pace at that erosion to your brick and mortar, I think, has tempered a fair amount. And so I think that's good news. If you also hear folks, they prefer in-person experiences. So going to the brick and mortar is going to provide a better experience than shopping online. Hotels. So
One
hotels.
sec, Jack.
Go ahead.
Karen, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just curious, I'm thinking about Northway Mall, and, it was a very large footprint, and now it's had chunks taken out of it. How does that affect, is it by the square footage that is now sitting there, or how does their tax base change on the structure?
Yeah, through the chair too, Branga, I don't know specifically the nuances of that property and the valuation of it, but I do know that we went out there this last year. We looked at it, and we basically are like, okay, this is no longer what it was. And so we try to reflect that, right? Like the whole middle is just demolitioned right now. It's demoed, it's gone. We wipe it off of the assessment.
Yeah.
So, but I think that gets to what I was saying, is that removing the building brings the valuation down. So there's like this, rather than, I think, it's interesting to think about in the concept of adaptive reuse, right? Like, are we incentivizing people to build on their property, or are we incentivizing people to demolish vacant buildings? Yeah, so just it's interesting to think about. Thanks.
Meg.
So I was curious what a hotel conversion does to property value. So I looked up the Barrett valuation, and it was purchased in 2022 and then converted into residential. I don't know if that changes because it was a hotel turned into, but the valuation jumped $1.2 million. And so I know some improvements were made, of course, but I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is when we take an older hotel and we convert it to housing. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just kind of curious what it does for our community.
Yeah, through the chair to Zalto on that. I think what's been interesting in the hotel is that I don't have a lot of information on this, but what I have heard and seen is that, especially like in the Midtown area, especially where you have like the newer hotels, some of the older hotels are having a challenge to compete with those newer hotels. You go down to you go to downtown, and I think the older hotels are the exception, right? You have like the old Captain Cook; they're doing very well. But anyways, as a result of some of these that are having a challenge competing against the newer hotels, I think you are starting to see the option of converting to residential a little bit more attractive, right? That from that. So maybe hopefully that will at least have a somewhat of a discussion on it.
No. Bueller. Seems like people are happy. You don't want to kind of put any cap on it?
I don't,
Any final notes?
I don't think, are we close to being on time here?
No, we have more time
Oh,
if you
okay.
want to keep going, but, okay, if you want to keep going.
Okay.
Trying to cut him off.
No,
Yeah, I
just thought we were
could, I
done.
could.
I thought we'd been through it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So anyways, long story short, with hotels though, yes, they're going up. But you also have been seeing their revenue. They've been having really strong revenue since the pandemic time, and that's largely what this slide's demonstrating. Personal property. So personal property, as these pictures show, is lots of stuff. Inventory, machinery, equipment, mobile homes. I think yesterday there was a discussion on, but mobile homes that are personally owned in the mobile home card, those are exempt. Mobile homes that are residing on mobile home carts owned by the mobile home owner, those are subject to property tax. Here we go. Here is the last of the kind of the trends. Here's the personal property in today's dollars spanning 1986 to 2024. You can see kind of that pandemic time period. We did take a dip in our values. I think that was tax year 2021. And we're slowly kind of getting increasing from that. Here is personal property as kind of more of a breakdown of it. Inventory and supplies, 1.3 billion. So that's basically the, half of the value. And of inventory and supplies, inventory is like 90% of that $1.3 billion bucket. It's pretty much all inventory. And then obviously the next one here, equipment. So that's going to be your heavy person, special purpose, and so forth for that.
So with the new Amazon distribution warehouse here in town, so the day we count the property, we capture that merchandise and the valuation of it for tax purposes here in town. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, through the chair to Zalto, that is a good question. I don't know the nuances of that, but if I had to guess, you probably won't like this answer, but if I had to take a guess, that most of those packages in there no longer are owned by Amazon.
Can you dig into that a little bit? Because that's a question that's come up actually by constituents a few times. What does it mean to have Amazon here? Do they pay taxes? What does this all mean? And I think the the inventory tax is where we think about it most likely because it's stuff. So if we can take that offline and just kind of noodle it a bit, I would really appreciate it.
I would offer that what's interesting about their operation is they have like 50 vehicles or more, but they're all on a contract, right? And so they're like leased by Amazon from Enterprise, their business center. And that is a very interesting thing to contemplate because all of that equipment, everything they have in that building would be taxable. The packages, I think I'm of a mind that they aren't owned by them, but who knows? We can investigate it. But all that equipment, that building, and all those vehicles, but the vehicles are mostly owned by another entity. That's very interesting. Other than just the land base. Interesting question. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, so now getting towards the end here, valuation notices. So these will be sent out on Monday. Appeal deadline this year is the 12th. So February 12th, you can see that on that. And looking at the overview of the appeal period this year. So again, January 13th, so Monday, we will be sending out the valuation notices. They're all printed, ready to go. The second thing, green, yellow, orange, red. The point of those colors is during the 30-day informal review period, if you have constituents coming and having concerns, tell them to come early. A lot of issues can be resolved during that 30-day informal review period without having to file a formal appeal. Towards the end, I have red because if someone comes in, we're probably going to say, look, we can't get to it now. We don't have enough time. We recommend filing an appeal to preserve your due process rights. We do have an appeal. We do also have a deadline to submit So February 12th, that's the deadline again for appealing. We also have a deadline to submit evidence. That'll be February 27th. Typically, if the evidence is very helpful and will resolve the issue, we will take that information from that. If it's not something that's going to be very helpful to resolve it, it's not going to be the crux of the issue. Typically, we will say, look, we don't have the time to do that. There was a deadline for that. Working the appeal, so typically that'll be about mid-February through about mid-May. And then we have the Board of Equalization, that's April and May. So this is a quick count of appeals by year. You can see 2019, we had a lot, and that was largely the earthquake. And then last year we had 311 appeals for that. And when you look at that 311 appeals, I think I really like this slide because it really does show 86% of the appeals that were filed were settled without a Board of Equalization hearing. That means that the appraiser and the property owner agreed on some type of value. And it's not uncommon that we will reduce the value, especially because there can be condition issues, or perhaps maybe they give us a sale price for that. 83% had some type of reduced value. You can see in that second bullet point to the left. We also have a deposit, and 97% of deposits were returned to us. The only time, at least for last year, where the deposit was not returned to them is that 3% that were the appellant failed to appear at the Board of Equalization hearing. And then you got the 11%, so that 11% is where the Board of Equalization heard the appeal and the property owner was there. And you can see some of the stats as well from that. So with that, I would say thank you. And again, February 12th, that's the appeal deadline for property owners. Tell them to come early if they have any questions, as we can try to work with them. So
Any
thank you.
last questions? I think you've succeeded in whatever your mission was. Thank you, Jack.
Yeah.
Bye.